Brooklyn, New York. In 1973, Frank Matthews was a powerful drug trafficker, operating at the highest level of illegal narcotics distribution across the United States. He was not a small figure in the streets. He was a central force, a man whose name carried weight in cities far beyond New York. At that moment, he was facing serious federal charges. He was expected to appear in a Brooklyn courthouse, where he would answer for tax evasion and conspiracy to distribute heroin and cocaine. The courthouse represented the authority of the United States legal system. It was a place where many powerful men had already fallen. For most figures in the drug trade, this moment marked the beginning of the end. Once the federal system focused on an individual, the outcome was usually clear. Prison was not a possibility. It was an expectation. Brooklyn at the time was known for its deep and organized criminal networks. It was a place where large amounts of money moved quietly through hidden systems. Entire neighborhoods were shaped by the presence of the drug trade. Power was not always visible, but it was always present. Behind closed doors, decisions were made that affected entire communities. It was also a place of constant tension. Law enforcement agencies were increasing their efforts. Federal investigations were becoming more detailed and more aggressive. At the same time, rival groups competed for territory, supply routes, and influence. Trust was limited. Loyalty was often temporary. Every move carried risk. At the time, Matthews was one of the most influential independent traffickers in the country. He was not controlled by traditional organized crime groups. He built his own system and maintained his own authority. This made him both respected and targeted. The environment rewarded discipline, planning, and control. Those who could move product across state lines without attracting attention gained power quickly. Those who managed money carefully were able to build long-term operations. But the same environment punished mistakes without delay. One wrong move could lead to arrest, betrayal, or death. Matthews stood at the center of this system. He understood its rules. He operated within them, but he also shaped them. As the date of his court appearance approached, the pressure around him increased. The system had closed in. The next step seemed certain. But certainty, in this world, was often an illusion. By the early 1970s, Frank Matthews had established himself as one of the most powerful drug traffickers in America. His operations stretched across 21 states, forming a network that moved large quantities of heroin and cocaine. His earnings reached levels rarely seen in the illegal trade, bringing in tens of millions of dollars each year. He was not only known for his wealth, but for the structure of his operation. Matthews organized his business with precision. He built connections in multiple cities. He created systems that allowed him to control supply and distribution without constant exposure. This level of organization set him apart from many others in the same world. A former street-level operator, Matthews had worked his way up through direct experience. He understood the risks because he had lived them. He knew how the system functioned at every level, from small transactions to large-scale movement of drugs across state lines. This knowledge shaped his decisions. He carried himself with a calm and controlled demeanor. He did not rely on unnecessary displays of power. Instead, his authority came from consistency and results. Those who worked with him understood that his decisions were calculated. This created both respect and caution among those around him. Among other traffickers, Matthews represented independence. At a time when many operations were influenced or controlled by larger organized crime groups, he maintained his own system. He did not operate under the authority of the Italian mafia. Instead, he built a network that answered only to him. This independence was significant. It showed that it was possible to operate at the highest level without being absorbed into existing power structures. For many, he became a symbol of control in a system dominated by larger forces. He also demonstrated an ability to manage risk. His operations were structured to reduce direct exposure. He used trusted individuals and organized methods to keep distance between himself and daily activity. This approach allowed him to grow while avoiding immediate attention from law enforcement. At the same time, his success made him visible in another way. Federal authorities began to recognize the scale of his operation. Investigations increased. Surveillance expanded. The system that once allowed him to grow quietly began to turn its full attention toward him. Despite this, Matthews did not show signs of panic. His actions suggested patience. He continued to operate, even as pressure increased. To some, this appeared as confidence. To others, it seemed like risk. Within his circle, he was seen as a leader who understood the long game. He did not react quickly or emotionally. He observed, calculated, and acted when necessary. This approach built loyalty among those who depended on his decisions. But the system he had built also placed him in a difficult position. The same network that brought him success now made him a central target. The charges he faced were serious. The consequences were clear. If he followed the expected path, the outcome would likely be prison. In the history of organized crime, this moment had repeated many times. Powerful figures rose, built systems, gained wealth, and eventually faced the full force of the law. Very few avoided that ending. Frank Matthews stood at that exact point. His past had shaped him. His system had elevated him. His reputation had defined him. What remained was the decision that would determine how his story would end. But not everyone respected Frank Matthews. One force in particular, the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the United States legal system, embodied a different kind of danger. Unlike rivals in the streets, this force did not act with emotion or impulse. It moved with patience, structure, and long-term intent. Federal authorities were experienced, organized, and known for building strong cases over time. They had taken down many powerful figures before Matthews. Their method was clear. They watched, they gathered evidence, and they waited until the moment was right. When they moved with purpose. They believed in control through law. Their goal was not just to stop small operations, but to dismantle entire networks. Matthews, with his reach across 21 states and his large-scale distribution system, became a priority. At the same time, another opposing force existed within the criminal world. The Italian mafia, long established in organized crime, viewed independent operators like Matthews as a challenge to their influence. They were known for enforcing control through pressure and violence. Their past actions showed that they did not tolerate competition easily. This created two layers of threat around Matthews. One came from the law, structured and persistent. The other came from rival power, protective of its position. Both forces believed in control. Both forces had removed others before him. And both had learned how to operate without immediate consequence. Frank Matthews continued his operations by exploiting weaknesses in the system around him. He built a network that spread across many states, making it harder for any single authority to fully track his activities. His structure created distance between himself and the daily movement of drugs, reducing direct evidence that could be used against him. At the time, coordination between different law enforcement agencies was not always strong. Information did not always move quickly or clearly across state lines. This allowed large operations like Matthews to function longer than expected. Authority tolerated certain gaps in enforcement because of limited resources and the complexity of tracking organized networks. Investigations required time, and building a strong case required patience. During that time, figures like Matthews were able to continue operating. He also maintained control within his own system. By organizing his network carefully, he reduced the chances of internal betrayal. This added another layer of protection against law enforcement efforts. Over time, Matthews came to believe that he could manage the risks around him. His continued success, combined with his ability to avoid immediate consequences, reinforced this belief. He had built a system that worked. He had operated for years without being stopped. And as pressure increased, he remained steady, continuing to move forward within the same structure that had brought him success. But the system was changing. The attention on him was growing. And the space he once used to operate quietly was becoming smaller. The first incident occurred during a routine legal process. Frank Matthews was scheduled to appear in a Brooklyn courthouse on July 2, 1973. It was a standard requirement under federal authority. For most defendants, This moment followed a clear path. They arrived, they stood before the court, and they entered a system that rarely released them. But without overt escalation, the pressure around Matthews became visible. Federal authorities had already built their case. The charges were serious. The expectation was clear. He was to present himself and submit to the process. On that day, Matthews did not appear. There was no public statement. No confrontation. No visible reaction. The system waited, and he simply did not arrive. He noticed the weight of the situation long before that day. He understood what the charges meant. He understood what the courtroom represented. Yet instead of responding in the expected way, he chose silence and absence. To observers, this appeared as avoidance. Some saw it as fear. Others saw it as a sign that pressure had finally broken him. In a world where reputation was tied to visible strength, not showing up could be misread as weakness. Those close to Frank Matthews expected a different reaction. They expected him to face the charges directly, or to make a visible move that showed control. In that environment, strength was often demonstrated through action. Standing firm, even in the face of danger, was seen as a measure of power. But Matthews chose restraint. His decision was not made in the moment. It was the result of planning. Those who understood how he operated knew that he rarely acted without preparation. His absence from the courthouse was not confusion. It was intention. To those who did not understand, it looked like retreat. But to those familiar with the environment, it suggested something else. It suggested that he had already made a decision before the system expected him to respond. Patience, in that world, was often misunderstood. It did not always appear strong. It did not create immediate impact. But it allowed space for controlled action. Those who observed closely began to recognize that Matthews was not reacting to pressure. He was moving according to a plan that others could not yet see. The system believed it had reached him. But Matthews had already stepped outside of it. The next incident occurred shortly after the missed court date, as federal authorities began their full response. This time, the provocation was stronger. The FBI issued warrants and expanded their investigation. They placed a financial bounty on Frank Matthews, one of the highest at the time. His name was now active across agencies. His operation was no longer quiet. It was a national target. Again, Matthews remained restrained. There was no message, no negotiation, no attempt to explain. He did not contact the court. He did not appear through legal channels. He allowed the system to move without him. Each step increased the confidence of the authorities. They believed pressure would force a mistake. In their experience, no one could disappear completely. Eventually, everyone made contact, and when they did, they were caught. In environments like this, confidence becomes dangerous. The next incident occurred as federal agents began searching known locations connected to Matthews. This time, the provocation extended to his network. Properties were investigated. Associates were questioned. Surveillance widened across multiple states. The system was applying pressure in every direction. Again, Matthews remained restrained. He did not return to familiar places. He did not reach out in ways that could be traced. There was no visible reaction to the increasing attention. His absence remained complete. Each action strengthened the belief that the system would close in. Investigators assumed that movement, even small movement, would create a trace. In environments like this, confidence becomes dangerous. The next incident occurred as time passed and no clear leads emerged. This time, the provocation became frustration. The FBI followed every available path. Financial trails were examined. International connections were explored. Resources continued to be used. Again, Matthews remained restrained. There were no confirmed sightings. No verified communication. No evidence that could place him in a specific location. His disappearance held. Each passing month increased the belief that capture was only a matter of time. The system had solved many cases before. It expected the same outcome. In environments like this, confidence becomes dangerous. The next incident occurred years later, as the case remained open. This time, the provocation was persistence. Investigators continued to search. They revisited old leads. They tracked possible connections across borders. The case did not close. Again, Matthews remained restrained. There was still no trace. No confirmed identity under a new name. No reliable information from those who once worked with him. Silence continued. Each year without resolution increased both effort and belief. The system did not accept failure easily. In environments like this, confidence becomes dangerous. The next incident occurred as decades passed. This time, the provocation became uncertainty. The search had extended beyond normal limits. The case remained active, but answers did not appear. Again, Matthews remained restrained. No body was found. No confirmed contact with family was recorded. His disappearance remained complete. Each passing decade changed the nature of the search. What began as a manhunt became a question without an answer. In environments like this, confidence becomes dangerous. Everything changed when Frank Matthews disappeared not only from the system, but from every known connection in his life. He did not leave behind a traceable path. He did not maintain visible contact with his organization. Even those who had worked closely with him across 21 states provided no confirmed information. This incident crossed a line. In most cases, pressure breaks networks. Someone speaks. Someone makes a mistake. Information surfaces over time. But in this case, the expected pattern did not occur. Authority response was extensive, but it produced no result. The FBI searched across countries, followed leads, and maintained the case for decades. Despite this, no confirmed evidence emerged. From that moment, the outcome became inevitable. The case shifted from pursuit to uncertainty. The system had reached its limits. What remained was not a capture, but a disappearance that could not be explained. That evening, Frank Matthews spoke quietly. There was no public gathering, no official record of what was said, and no direct communication with authorities. His voice did not reach beyond a small and trusted circle. But within that circle, his words carried weight. He did not threaten the system that was closing in on him. He did not speak with anger or urgency. There was no sign of panic in his tone. Instead, his words were controlled, simple, and final. He stated what would happen next. He would not go to court. He would not stand before a judge. He would not allow the system to decide his future. There would be no negotiation, no delay, no attempt to reduce the charges. His decision was not framed as resistance. It was framed as certainty. Those who heard him understood the meaning. In that environment, people listened carefully when a man like Matthews spoke. He was not known for making statements without action. His reputation had been built on discipline and follow-through. When he made a decision, it was already supported by preparation. There were no dramatic words. No promises of escape. No explanation of how it would happen. But the absence of detail did not create doubt. It created clarity. He had already planned his next move. To those closest to him, it became clear that the coming days would not follow the expected path. The system believed it had reached the final stage of control. But Matthews had stepped outside that structure before it could close. Some may have questioned the risk. Others may have wondered how far he could go without being found. But those thoughts remained unspoken. In that moment, what mattered was not how, but what. And what had been decided was simple. He would disappear. Not as a reaction, but as a choice. The room, if there was one, would have remained calm. There was no chaos, no raised voices. Only a quiet understanding that the next step would change everything. For Matthews, this was not a moment of fear. It was a moment of direction. And once spoken, it was not revisited. The setting of the final incident was ordinary. It was a courthouse in Brooklyn, New York. A place where legal process followed a clear structure. Every day, individuals entered, names were called, and cases moved forward. The system was built on routine, and that routine created a sense of order. On July 2, 1973, that routine continued. Court officials prepared for the day as they always did. Documents were arranged. Schedules were followed. There was no visible sign that anything unusual would occur. To those present, it was another standard day in a building that had seen countless cases before. Frank Matthews was expected to appear. His name was listed among others. His case was part of the schedule. The charges against him were serious, but the process was familiar. Defendants came, stood before the court, and faced the system. That was how it worked. Routine continued as usual. People moved through the halls. Lawyers prepared their arguments. Officers maintained order. The structure of the system remained steady, unaffected by individual cases. This contrast made what followed unforgettable. When Matthews' name was called, there was no response. At first, it may have seemed like a delay. A brief absence. A possibility that he would arrive moments later. But those moments passed. There was still no sign of him. No message was delivered to explain his absence. No representative stepped forward on his behalf. There was no communication to suggest that he would appear later in the day. He was simply not there. The courtroom, built on expectation and procedure, faced a break in its pattern. The system had prepared for his presence. Instead, it encountered silence. That silence carried meaning. It marked the point where control shifted. Until that moment, the process had followed a known path. Charges had been filed. A date had been set. The system was ready to act. But with his absence, that path no longer applied. Outside the courthouse, the implications began to form. Matthews had not made a mistake. He had not missed the date by accident. His absence was intentional. It aligned with the quiet declaration made earlier. He had chosen not to enter the system. As the day continued, the routine of the courthouse moved forward. Other cases were called. Other individuals stepped forward. The structure remained intact. But something had changed. The absence of one man had created a gap that could not be immediately filled. From that moment, the focus shifted from judgment to search. Authorities would begin to act. Warrants would be issued. Investigations would expand. What had been a scheduled appearance would become a national manhunt. But inside that courtroom, the moment itself remained simple. A name was called. No one answered. And in that silence, a new path was created. One that would not follow the expected ending. One that would not return to the system that had called his name. That ordinary setting became the last confirmed point of presence. Everything after that would be unknown. And that is what made it unforgettable. The Federal Bureau of Investigation escalated publicly. This time, there was no ambiguity. Frank Matthews was no longer just a defendant who failed to appear in court. He was now a wanted man on a national level. His name was circulated across agencies. His image and identity were shared widely. A financial bounty was placed on him, one of the highest of its time. The message was clear. He was to be found. The system had moved from quiet preparation to open pursuit. Investigators followed every possible lead. They searched properties, questioned associates, and tracked financial movements. His disappearance was no longer treated as temporary. It was treated as a direct challenge. This was the moment where the pressure became visible to the public. The authorities believed that no one could remain hidden forever. History had shown that even the most careful figures eventually made a mistake. Time, they believed, would expose him. But Frank Matthews stood. Not in a courtroom. Not before a judge. But in his decision. He did not return. He did not respond. He did not adjust his path to meet the system halfway. His position remained unchanged, even as the pressure increased. To the authorities, this was defiance. To those who understood his earlier silence, it was consistency. The system had made its final move. And Matthews had already made his. According to what can be understood from the sequence of events, everything happened in seconds. There was no long confrontation. No extended conflict. No visible struggle between opposing sides. The decisive action was not loud. It was controlled. Frank Matthews disappeared. The movement was precise. He left with approximately $20 million in cash. He took with him Cheryl Denise Brown, the one person he trusted. There were no signs of hesitation. No evidence of confusion. Every step suggested preparation. Before intervention was possible, the outcome was decided. Authorities began their search, but they were already behind. There was no immediate trail to follow. No confirmed direction. No clear starting point. The delay, even if small, was enough. By the time the system fully reacted, Matthews was gone. Completely. There were no verified sightings. No confirmed contact with family. No reliable information from those who had once worked within his network. Across 21 states, silence remained. The FBI expanded its efforts. They searched across the country and beyond. Leads were followed. Resources were used. Years passed. But the decisive moment had already occurred. It was not marked by violence in the traditional sense. There were no gunshots, no public conflict. Instead, it was defined by absence. A controlled exit that removed him entirely from the reach of the system. In that moment, the expected outcome of his case was replaced. There would be no trial. No sentence. No prison. The system had prepared for one ending. Frank Matthews chose another. And once that choice was carried out, it could not be undone. Frank Matthews stopped immediately. Not in the way the system expected, and not in the place they had prepared for him. There was no arrest, no physical capture, and no moment where authority stood over him and gave commands. Instead, his stop came through absence. He removed himself from the process completely. He did not resist authority in a visible way. He did not confront federal agents. He did not engage in violence. He did not create a public standoff. There was no dramatic escape in front of witnesses. His decision avoided direct conflict altogether. By choosing not to appear, and by disappearing before the system could act, he denied authority the moment it was prepared for. The courtroom remained ready, but he was not there to stand within it. Before being removed from the reach of the system, he delivered a single, final line. It was not spoken in a courtroom. It was not recorded in official documents. But it was understood through his actions. He would not be judged. That message did not require words. It was carried in the precision of his disappearance. Every step he took reinforced that final decision. There would be no cooperation, no return, and no correction of his absence. The system called his name. He answered with silence. And that silence became his final statement. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the legal system remained in place, but with a lasting consequence. They had faced powerful figures before, and they had brought many of them into custody. But this case was different. Despite years of effort, they could not produce a result. The search continued, but it did not lead to capture. The absence of Frank Matthews became a permanent gap in a system built on resolution. Behavior across the environment began to change. Within law enforcement, new attention was placed on coordination and tracking across states. Cases like this highlighted the difficulty of managing large, organized networks that operated beyond local boundaries. In the criminal world, the story carried a different meaning. Matthews' disappearance showed that another outcome was possible. Not prison. Not death. But complete removal from the system. It was rare, and it required discipline, planning, and timing. But it had been done. At the same time, it also created uncertainty. No one knew where he went. No one could confirm if he remained alive. The success of his escape was clear, but the cost and reality behind it remained unknown. The message required no repetition. It existed in the facts. A man facing decades in prison failed to appear in court. He took millions in cash. He disappeared with no confirmed trace. And for more than 50 years, no authority has been able to reverse that outcome. In a system where endings are usually known, this one remained open. And that is what made it lasting. When events were reviewed, a pattern emerged. At first, investigators treated the case as a standard failure to appear. They expected a short search, followed by capture. This had happened many times before. Most fugitives made contact with someone. Most left behind a trail. Most were found. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the situation began to change. Escalation became clear. The case moved from a local court issue to a national investigation. Federal agencies increased their efforts. More resources were assigned. Matthews' name was placed on wanted lists. A financial reward was offered. The search expanded across state lines and eventually beyond the country. Each step followed a familiar pattern used in major cases. But the expected results did not follow. Warnings had been present before the disappearance. Matthews had faced serious federal charges. He understood the weight of those charges. He knew what the courtroom represented. The system had given him a clear signal. Appear and face judgment. Instead, he chose another path. His earlier silence, his careful behavior, and his controlled actions all pointed to preparation. These were not the actions of someone reacting in panic. They were the actions of someone who had already made a decision. System failure became visible over time. The investigation revealed gaps in coordination. Information moved, but not always fast enough. Leads were followed, but none produced a confirmed result. His network, once seen as a weakness that could expose him, became a structure that protected his absence. Even those who had worked with him did not provide answers. Across 21 states, there was no confirmed information that could lead to his location. No reliable sighting. No financial trail that could be proven. Authorities searched internationally. They explored every possible direction. Years of effort produced no clear conclusion. The system had reached its limit. The conclusion was unavoidable. Frank Matthews had successfully disappeared. Not temporarily, but completely. There was no body to confirm death. No evidence to confirm survival. Only the fact that he had removed himself from the reach of law enforcement and remained beyond it. In most cases, time reveals the truth. In this case, time only confirmed the absence. The pattern was complete. Escalation had occurred. Warnings had been given. The system had acted. And still, the outcome remained unchanged. Frank Matthews was gone. And nothing that followed was able to bring him back into view. Long after the incident, the story continued to circulate. It moved through conversations, through communities, and through time. It was repeated by those who studied the case and by those who simply heard the name. Years passed, then decades, and still the story remained. Not because of spectacle. There was no final confrontation. No courtroom drama. No public ending that could be replayed or retold in clear detail. There was only a moment of absence, followed by silence that never broke. But because of meaning. The case stood apart from others like it. In a system where outcomes were usually known, this one remained open. Most figures in that world followed a clear path. They were arrested, convicted, or killed. Their stories ended in ways that could be documented and explained. Frank Matthews did not follow that path. He created a different outcome. One that removed him completely from the system that was prepared to judge him. His disappearance became more than an event. It became a question that could not be answered. In places like this, control is everything. Power is measured by who can act and who can avoid being acted upon. The system is designed to close every gap, to track every movement, and to bring every case to a conclusion. But this case showed that control is not always complete. It showed that preparation, timing, and discipline could change an expected ending. At the same time, it also left uncertainty behind. No one can confirm where he went. No one can say how long he remained safe. The success of his disappearance is clear, but the reality of his life after that moment is unknown. This is what gives the story its weight. It is not just about escape. It is about the absence of closure. It is about a system that could not complete its process, and a man who stepped outside of it at the final moment. For those who study such cases, it remains a point of reference. For those who lived within that environment, it remains a reminder that even in systems built on control, there can be exceptions. And those exceptions are not forgotten. In a world where every ending is expected, the rarest outcome is the one that never arrives.